You're too fragile for this house, Dad. My son didn't raise his voice when he said it. He didn't have to. The words carried just fine across the driveway. I was standing beside my old pickup truck with a navy duffel bag at my feet and a ring of keys in my hand that no longer opened anything. The brass deadbolt I had installed myself 15 years earlier was gone. In its place was a sleek black keypad glowing blue in the late afternoon light. You fell twice this year, Melissa added from the porch. We can't keep worrying about you on those stairs. I glanced past them through the front window. My wife's oak porch rocker was still visible in the corner of the living room. The sunlight hit the curved armrest the way it always had at that hour. I could almost see her there, knitting needles moving. I didn't fall twice, I said calmly. I tripped once over your dog's leash. Daniel shifted his weight but didn't meet my eyes. That's not the point. You cracked a rib. You were in rehab 10 days. What happens next time? Next time. There's always a next time when someone wants to move you out of the present. I'm 72, I said, not 92. Melissa crossed her arms. This house isn't safe for you anymore. It's too much. Too much, too big, too many stairs, too many responsibilities, too many memories. I looked down at the keys in my hand and tried them again out of habit. The metal scraped uselessly against smooth plastic. Daniel reached over and gently closed my fist around them. We already changed the locks, he said, just until we figure things out. The porch rocker sat behind him like a witness. I nodded once, of course. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. Silence unsettles people more than anger ever could. Melissa handed me a glossy brochure. Silver Pines Retirement Community. They have monitored medication, emergency call buttons, organized activities. It's really nice. I glanced at the cover photo of a smiling gray-haired couple playing shuffleboard under string lights. Bingo and blood pressure checks, I said. Daniel exhaled. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Harder. I picked up my duffel bag. It was lighter than I expected. A few clothes, my shaving kit, the navy fireproof lockbox I'd kept in my study closet for years. I'd asked a nurse to bring it to me from the house while I was still in rehab. She'd assumed it was insurance paperwork. In a way, it was. As I walked toward the truck, Daniel called after me. Don't worry, the house is in our hands now. I paused, one hand on the door handle. In your hands, I repeated. Yeah, he said, almost defensively. We'll take care of it. I nodded again. I'm sure you will. I climbed into the truck, closed the door, and let the engine idle for a moment. Through the windshield, I could see Melissa already turning back toward the house, confident in the keypad's quiet authority. I drove to the end of the block before I took out my phone. At 4:37 p.m., I called First County Bank. Good afternoon, the young woman answered. This is Rachel in mortgage servicing. How can I help you? My name is Thomas Reynolds, I said. I need to stop this month's automatic draft on my mortgage. There was a brief pause as she pulled up my file. You're the sole borrower on the account, correct? That's right. Your next payment is scheduled for the 1st. If we process a stop request today, it will prevent the ACH from posting. That's exactly what I'd like to do. She asked me a few verification questions. Mother's maiden name, last 4 digits of my social, the original loan amount. When she was finished, she said, The draft has been cancelled, Mr. Reynolds. You'll receive written confirmation. Thank you, I replied. I ended the call and drove toward the interstate, leaving behind a house they believed was already theirs. They thought I was fragile. They had no idea how paperwork works. Before all of that, I was a civil engineer for 41 years. Bridges, overpasses, drainage systems, things that hold weight. I was never the flashy type. I didn't invent anything groundbreaking. I made sure other people's work didn't collapse. There's a certain dignity in that. Margaret and I bought that house 22 years ago when Daniel was finishing college. It wasn't a palace, despite what Melissa liked to imply to her friends. It was a two-story brick colonial with creaky stairs and a wide front porch. The mortgage was originally 30 years. I refinanced once after interest rates dropped, locked in a fixed rate just under 4%. When Margaret was diagnosed with ovarian cancer, we met with an estate attorney. Not because we were wealthy beyond reason, but because we were careful. The attorney suggested a revocable living trust. It would keep the house out of probate and allow me, as trustee, to maintain full control while I was alive. I remember Margaret squeezing my hand at that meeting. "Make it simple," she told the lawyer. "No confusion later." After she passed, I transferred the deed into the trust exactly as advised. I was the sole trustee. Daniel was listed as a future beneficiary, along with any children he might have someday. Ownership, I've learned, is not about assumption. It's about signatures. 5 years ago, Daniel and Melissa moved in temporarily. He'd lost his job with a marketing firm during a restructuring. Melissa had started an online boutique that hadn't yet turned a profit. "It'll just be for 6 months," Daniel had said. I didn't charge them rent. I continued paying the $3,218 monthly mortgage. I paid the property taxes, $7,940 the last year. I covered homeowners insurance and the quarterly pest control contract because termites don't care about employment status. They handled groceries and utilities, at least at first. Somewhere along the way, temporary became comfortable. Comfortable became expected. After my fall, one fall, caused by a dog leash stretched across the kitchen floor, Daniel insisted I consider installing stair lifts. I declined. My doctor called it an accident, not a trend. But while I was in the rehabilitation center, recovering strength in my side, something else was happening. Daniel had asked for my spare keys to check the mail and bring fresh clothes. Melissa visited once with a folder of brochures from assisted living facilities. "They have emergency pendants," she'd said brightly. "You just press a button if you feel dizzy." "I wasn't dizzy," I replied. "I tripped." She smiled in that patient way people use with children and the elderly. Still. On my 8th day in rehab, Daniel mentioned casually that he'd transferred the electric bill into his name. "Just to streamline things," he said, "since we're managing the house now." Managing. I remember that word sitting heavily in the air between us. On the day I was discharged, they picked me up in their SUV. Daniel helped me into the passenger seat, even though I didn't need the help. Melissa talked about how the house might be too much maintenance. When we pulled into the driveway and I saw the keypad lock, I understood that maintenance wasn't what they meant. "Don't worry," Daniel said that afternoon as I stood outside with my useless keys. "The house is in our hands now." I didn't ask him what he thought that meant. But the question stayed with me as I drove away. The extended stay hotel smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old carpet. I checked in under my own name and paid for a week up front. The clerk slid a plastic key card across the counter and told me breakfast was served from 6 to 9. I carried my duffel bag up in the elevator with 2 college boys arguing about a football game. Inside the room, I set the Navy lockbox on the small laminate desk and opened it. The trust documents were neatly clipped together. The deed transfer recorded with the county 17 years earlier. The mortgage statement from last month. Everything in black and white. Sole borrower, Thomas Reynolds. Trustee, Thomas Reynolds. Property owner of record, the Margaret and Thomas Reynolds Living Trust. There were no additional borrowers, no cosigners, no silent transfers. I ran my hand over the edge of the paper and let out a slow breath. Fragile. People confuse age with weakness because it makes their decisions easier. The next morning at 9, 02 a.m., I walked into First County Bank in person. Rachel from the phone call the day before greeted me with polite recognition. I requested confirmation in writing that the automatic draft had been cancelled. I also inquired about options for temporarily suspending payments while I evaluated my housing situation. As the sole borrower, you can request a forbearance review, she explained. It doesn't forgive the balance, but it pauses collection activity while we assess hardship. I'm aware, I said. I'd like to initiate that. She nodded and printed the necessary forms. There was no drama, no raised voices, just signatures. Before leaving, I also contacted my homeowner's insurance provider and clarified that no additional insured parties were to be added without my written authorization as trustee. The representative noted it in the file. Paper leaves trails, trails lead back to names. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't text. I let silence do what it does best. By the third day in the hotel, I imagined the lights flickering at the house, the realization dawning when the mortgage payment didn't draft, the confusion when the lender refused to discuss the account with anyone but me. But I also knew something else. Assumptions can live comfortably for years. Reality usually arrives in an envelope. And I suspected that envelope was already on its way. The first act of quiet dignity. The first thing I did after leaving the bank was buy a legal pad. Not because I was angry, because I've always believed that when something cracks, you measure it before you repair it. I sat at the small desk in the extended stay room and wrote 3 columns at the top of the page: mortgage, insurance, taxes. Underneath, I listed dates, amounts, account numbers. The mortgage was $3,218 a month. Insurance averaged $186. Property taxes were paid annually every October. There was no confusion about any of it. I called the insurance carrier again the next morning and asked to confirm in writing that only the trust was listed as named insured. The representative, a woman named Carla, read it back to me. The Margaret and Thomas Reynolds Living Trust, Trustee Thomas Reynolds. Thank you, I said. Please email that confirmation. I also contacted the utility companies. The electric and gas accounts had indeed been transferred into Daniel's name during my hospital stay. That told me 2 things. First, they believed they were settling in permanently. Second, they were preparing to demonstrate control. Control often announces itself quietly. By the 4th day, I had submitted the forbearance paperwork. I did not claim financial ruin. I cited a temporary change in primary residence and requested a short-term pause while I evaluated occupancy. Rachel at the bank explained it carefully. This doesn't remove your obligation, Mr. Reynolds. It just pauses required payment while we assess. I understand, I replied. I'm not avoiding the loan. I'm reconsidering who's living under it. She didn't ask further questions. I didn't tell Daniel. There is a difference between revenge and boundaries. Revenge is loud. Boundaries are filed. 3 days later, Mrs. Talbot from across the street called me. Tom, I hope you don't mind, she began, her voice lowered as if the hydrangeas might be listening. The landscapers came this morning. They were here about 10 minutes. And, I asked. They left, said something about non-payment. I thanked her and wished her a good afternoon. I did not smile, but I felt something settle into place. When money stops moving, reality starts. Building something new, Part 1. I moved into a 1-bedroom condo near Lake Emerson 2 weeks later. It wasn't grand. Beige carpet, white cabinets, a sliding glass door that stuck when humidity rose. But it had a small balcony overlooking the water, and the rent was $1,240 a month, less than half the mortgage I'd been carrying for years. On my second evening there, I carried Margaret's oak rocker out onto the balcony. I had retrieved it the morning after I left the house, before Daniel realized I'd come back for anything. It felt wrong to leave it behind. The wood creaked softly as I set it down, the familiar curve of the armrest smooth beneath my palm. Some things you move for comfort, some you move for clarity. A week after settling in, I called an old colleague, Harold Benson. We had spent 2 decades reviewing bridge load reports together. "I heard you retired," he said. "I did," I replied. "Turns out retirement isn't always quiet." He laughed. "What do you need?" "Purpose," I said plainly, "and perhaps a few hours of consulting work if you have any." 2 days later, I was reviewing structural inspection photos for a small county overpass. It wasn't glamorous. It paid $85 an hour, capped at 15 hours a week. But when I marked up the diagrams with a red pen, I felt steady again. Fragile men don't draft load calculations. The first paycheck deposited into my personal account felt different than the transfers I used to make to cover the household bills. This money represented something simple. I was still useful. On Saturday mornings, I walked along the lake path and spoke with a young engineer named Marcus who lived in the building next door. He had student loans and enthusiasm in equal measure. "You've been doing this longer than I've been alive," he said one morning. "Which means I've made more mistakes than you have," I replied. "Learn from them." We talked about soil compression ratios and expansion joints, as if the world were measured in tensile strength instead of entitlement. Meanwhile, back on Maple Drive, silence was turning into noise. Mrs. Talbot called again one Thursday. "There was a delivery truck," she said. "They tried to bring patio furniture. It left with the boxes still on board." "Why?" I asked. "They said something about an account hold." I thanked her again. I did not call Daniel. When entitlement meets paperwork, paperwork wins. Building something new, Part 2/turning point. About a month after I left the house, Daniel walked into First County Bank. I didn't know that until later, when Rachel mentioned it in passing. He asked about refinancing options, she told me carefully. We informed him he isn't listed on the loan. And he seemed surprised. Surprise is often the first crack in certainty. Daniel had assumed I would later learn that because he paid the electric bill and mowed the lawn, he had standing. He did not. Refinancing requires title ownership and borrower consent. The trust name on the deed prevented any unilateral maneuver. The due-on sale clause in the mortgage remained dormant because no sale had occurred. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just documents doing what documents are designed to do. One afternoon, Marcus knocked on my condo door. "You've got certified mail downstairs," he said. The envelope bore the bank's logo. Inside was a formal notice acknowledging my forbearance review and clarifying that no third parties were authorized to discuss the account. I folded the letter neatly and placed it back in the envelope. There are moments when you realize the storm isn't yours anymore. Mrs. Talbot called that same evening. "Tom, I hate to be the messenger," she said, "but there was some shouting today. From your son, something about the bank refusing to speak to him." I leaned back in the rocker on my balcony, listening to the lake water brush against the dark pilings. "He'll figure it out," I said quietly. What he would eventually figure out was simple. Assumption is not ownership. But the real turning point didn't arrive at the bank. It arrived in a high school classroom. Success becomes undeniable. By early spring, my consulting hours had doubled. Harold recommended me to another county, reviewing an aging pedestrian bridge. I spent mornings analyzing stress fractures and afternoons mentoring Marcus through his first independent report. The work was steady, measured, quiet. One Saturday, the local engineering association awarded me a small plaque recognizing long-term service to municipal infrastructure. It wasn't national news. It was a handshake, a photograph, and a catered lunch of overcooked chicken. Still, when Marcus clapped me on the shoulder and said, "You're not fragile, Mr. Reynolds," I smiled. Back on Maple Drive, however, the mailbox had become a source of tension. When the mortgage statement reflected the paused payment schedule, the bank's correspondence was addressed exclusively to me as trustee. Without my authorization, no one else could access detailed account information. Daniel attempted to add himself as an authorized contact. The request was denied. He requested copies of the deed from the county recorder's office. What he found there did not include his name. Reality, when it arrives, rarely shouts. It simply sits on paper. But the final unraveling came from someone who had no stake in ego at all. It came from my granddaughter. The truth starts surfacing. Emily was 16 that year, thoughtful and sharp in ways teenagers often are before the world dulls them. For a civics assignment, her class was asked to research a local property record and explain how ownership is documented. Emily typed our Maple Drive address into the county's online database. She expected to see her father's name. Instead, she saw the Margaret and Thomas Reynolds Living Trust. She told me later that she refreshed the page twice, assuming she'd made a mistake. She hadn't. The deed transfer date was clearly recorded 17 years earlier. The trustee listed as Thomas Reynolds, no co-owners, no joint tenancy, no transfer on death filed beyond the trust itself. She clicked the mortgage lien summary. The borrower name matched the trustee. That evening at dinner, she asked Daniel, "Dad, why isn't your name on the house?" According to her, the fork paused halfway to his mouth. "What do you mean?" he asked. "It says Grandpa's trust owns it." Silence, she said, settled over the table. Melissa reportedly laughed first. "That can't be right." Emily turned her phone toward them. It was right. Daniel told her there must be some delay in updating records. There was. By the end of the week, he requested official copies of the trust filing from the county clerk. The language was straightforward. Beneficiaries inherit upon the death of the surviving trustee. Until then, control remains with the trustee. "With me," Emily told him quietly. "Dad, this isn't your house." That sentence did what months of silence had not. It replaced assumption with fact. 2 nights later, as I sat on my balcony watching the last of the light settle across Lake Emerson, my phone rang. I looked at the screen for a long moment before answering. It was Daniel. And for the first time in weeks, his voice did not sound certain. The reckoning scene. The phone vibrated against the laminate kitchen table just after 8 o'clock. I didn't answer on the first ring. I let it buzz 3 times while I rinsed my coffee mug in the sink, watching the dark water swirl down the drain. When I finally wiped my hands on a dish towel and pressed the green button, I didn't say hello. I just held the receiver to my ear and waited. "Dad." Daniel's voice sounded thin. The forced confidence from the driveway on Maple Drive was gone, replaced by a slight, rhythmic hesitation I hadn't heard since he was 16 and had backed my sedan into a brick retaining wall. "I'm here, Daniel," I said calmly. "Emily showed us the county recorder website," he began. He swallowed hard enough that I could hear it over the line. "She looked up the property taxes for school. She showed us the deed." "I know." "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. There was a tremor of grievance left in him, a lingering attempt to make my silence the crime rather than his assumption. "Why did you let us believe the house was ours?" I pulled out a chair and sat down, keeping my posture straight. "I never told you the house was yours, Daniel. You told me it was in your hands. I simply didn't argue with you." In the background, muffled through the receiver, I could hear Melissa crying. It wasn't the soft, sorrowful weeping of grief. It was the sharp, breathless sound of someone whose calendar had suddenly lost its moorings. "We got a letter today," Daniel muttered. Certified mail from First County Bank. It was addressed to you as trustee, but the mail carrier made Melissa sign for it. She opened it. That is a federal offense, Daniel, I noted quietly. But since you read it, what did it say? It said the mortgage is in a formal forbearance review, he said, his voice dropping an octave. It said that because the sole borrower is no longer occupying the primary residence, the lender is evaluating the loan for status modification or acceleration. It said unauthorized occupants have no standing to negotiate terms. He paused, waiting for me to rescue him from the vocabulary. I didn't. You canceled the payments, he whispered. I paused my payments, I corrected. I am 72 years old. My retirement income is finite. Why would I pay $3,200 a month for a brick building I do not have keys to enter? We thought the house was paid off, he blurted out. We thought Mom left it clear. Your mother left it protected, I said. There is a mortgage because I refinanced 17 years ago to pay for her experimental chemotherapy and to fund your college tuition without taking out high-interest student loans. I have been paying that debt every month since. The silence on the line stretched out for nearly half a minute. We don't have $3,200 a month, Dad, Daniel finally said. Melissa's business is barely breaking even. If the bank calls the loan, we have nowhere to go. I know your financial situation better than you think, I replied. Please, he said. It is a strange and heavy thing to hear your own child beg for shelter you already provided them for 5 years. But apology and panic are not the same thing. Panic asks for relief from consequences. Apology asks for restoration of truth. I will not discuss this over the telephone, I told him. If you and Melissa wish to talk about the future of the Margaret and Thomas Reynolds Living Trust, you can come to my apartment tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. Bring Emily. Okay, he whispered. Okay, we'll be there. And Daniel. Yes, Dad. Do not park in the reserved space. They tow. The apology and its limits. They arrived at 9:55. I opened the door to find the three of them standing in the narrow hallway. Daniel wore a button-down shirt he usually saved for church. Melissa had left off her oversized sunglasses and stood with her hands folded tightly over her purse. Only Emily looked steady, her canvas backpack slung over one shoulder, her chin lifted with calm curiosity. Come in, I said, stepping aside. The living room was small, but clean. I had brewed a pot of coffee and set out 3 ceramic mugs on the low table. As Melissa stepped past the sofa, her eyes traveled toward the sliding glass door leading to the balcony. She stopped. Sitting out on the concrete ledge, catching the morning sun from across Lake Emerson, was Margaret's oak porch rocker. Melissa stared at the curved wooden armrests, the spindle back, the faded cushion she had labeled as clutter 3 months earlier. She looked at the rocker, and then she looked at my face. You took it, she whispered. I retrieved it, I said, pointing toward the chairs around my small dining table. Please sit. No one touched the coffee. Daniel leaned his elbows on his knees, staring down at his knuckles. Dad, he started, his voice cracking slightly. I was wrong. I waited. I shouldn't have taken your keys, he said, forcing the words out one by one. I shouldn't have changed the deadbolt to a keypad without asking you. I shouldn't have told you that you were too fragile to climb the stairs. Why did you? I asked. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot. Because I was afraid. I was 43 years old, my career was stalled, and I felt like a guest in the only place that felt stable. When you fell, I panicked. I told myself that if we took over the house, I would finally feel like a provider. I convinced myself you were ready to step aside. You didn't just step aside me, Daniel, I said. You erased me. You transferred the electric bill the day after my surgery. You handed me a brochure for an assisted living facility, while my ribs were still taped. Melissa reached out and touched his sleeve, then looked directly at me. Her cheeks were blotchy, but her tone was stripped of its usual defensiveness. "I wanted the primary bedroom," she said quietly. "That's the honest truth, Thomas. I wanted the closet space and the garden view, and every time I looked at you reading the paper at the kitchen table, I felt like we were waiting for you to die so our real lives could start." The words were ugly, but they were true. True words, no matter how sharp, do less damage than polite lies. "Thank you for your honesty, Melissa," I said. Emily sat silently between her parents, watching us with the clear-eyed gravity of a girl who was learning how adulthood actually worked. "What happens now, Dad?" Daniel asked. "Are you going to let the bank foreclose?" "No," I replied. "I spent 40 years building a clean credit history. I have no intention of destroying it to teach you a lesson." I reached into the drawer of the side table and pulled out a manila folder containing 3 printed documents. I laid them flat on the table. "This is a standard residential lease agreement," I explained. "Drafted by my attorney, Harold Brooks. It lists the Margaret and Thomas Reynolds Living Trust as the landlord and Daniel and Melissa Reynolds as tenants." Daniel stared at the cover page. "A lease. If you wish to remain on Maple Drive, you will pay $1,500 on the first of every month," I told them. "That covers half the mortgage. I will subsidize the remaining balance from my retirement account, as I have always done. You will pay the property taxes annually in October. You will not alter the locks, the landscaping, or the structural walls without my written consent as trustee." "And if we can't pay $1,500, Melissa asked softly. "Then you will give 60 days notice and vacate the premises," I replied, "just like any other tenant." Daniel looked at the paper, then back at me. "You're treating us like strangers." "I am treating you like adults," I said. "Respect is not automatic. It is contractual. Earned reconciliation." They signed the papers that morning at 11:15. There were no embraces, no dramatic tears of relief. Daniel used my black gel pen, his signature tight and small on the bottom line. Melissa signed beside him, her hand steadying the page. When they were finished, I handed them their copies and placed the original back into the fireproof box. "Your first payment is due on the 1st of next month," I told them. "I will notify First County Bank tomorrow that the forbearance review can be closed and regular monthly ACH drafts will resume." "Thank you, Dad," Daniel said, standing up. He looked smaller in his shirt than he had on the driveway a month ago, but his shoulders were square. "We'll see you Sunday," Melissa asked tentatively. "For dinner." "Not this Sunday," I said gently. "Let's give the ink time to dry. Call me in 2 weeks." They left together, their footsteps quiet down the carpeted hallway. Emily stayed behind. She had asked her father for permission to spend the afternoon with me, claiming she needed help organizing her civics research paper. After the door clicked shut, she walked out onto the balcony and sat down in Margaret's oak rocker. She swung slightly back and forth, her canvas sneakers barely touching the concrete. "They were really scared, Grandpa," she said without looking back. "I know," I replied, stepping out beside her and leaning against the metal railing. "Are you still mad at them?" "No," I said. "Anger requires too much maintenance, Emily. At my age, I prefer peace." Over the next 6 months, the rhythm of our family shifted into a new gear. The first monthly transfer of $1,500 appeared in my trust account on the 28th of the month, 3 days early. Daniel called me twice a week, not to ask for favors, but to report on the gutters he had cleaned or the furnace filter he had replaced. When October arrived, Daniel sent me a scanned receipt from the county tax assessor's office. He had paid the $7,900 out of a separate savings account he and Melissa had built by cutting back her boutique inventory and taking on weekend consulting gigs. It wasn't easy for them, but pride earned through discipline always feels better than pride borrowed from entitlement. In November, I visited Harold Brooks at his law firm downtown. We amended the Margaret and Thomas Reynolds Living Trust. I remained the sole primary trustee, but I removed Daniel as the immediate successor. In his place, I designated Emily Reynolds, effective upon her 21st birthday, with Harold acting as interim guardian if anything happened to me before then. "You're skipping a generation, Tom," Harold asked, peering over his reading glasses. "I am protecting a generation," I corrected. "Daniel knows how to pay rent now. Emily will know how to manage property." When I told Emily about the change over lunch by the lake, she didn't cheer. She just nodded, her jaw setting with the same quiet resolve I used to see in her grandmother. "I won't let you down, Grandpa," she said. "I know you won't," I told her. Fragile was never about bones. It was about boundaries. Closing moral monologue, plus direct address CTA. People confuse age with weakness because it makes them feel powerful. When you reach 70, the world begins to speak to you in a different register. Store clerks call you young man as a joke. Doctors explain your own joints to you as if you weren't there when you wore them out. And sometimes, the children you fed, clothed, and carried begin to look at your patience and mistake it for surrender. They see gray hair and assume your memory is fading. They see a slower walk and assume your authority has expired. But silence is not compliance. You do not have to raise your voice to defend your dignity. You do not have to slam doors, hire aggressive litigators, or engage in screaming matches on the front lawn to remind people who you are. The truth does not need a megaphone. It only requires a paper trail. I have lived 41 years by the laws of civil engineering, and the greatest lesson I ever learned is that any structure will eventually fail if the load is not distributed correctly. When you carry every burden for your children without letting them feel the weight of the roof over their heads, you do not make them strong. You make them fragile. And when they eventually try to push you out into the cold, it is not because they hate you. It is because they have never been taught what shelter actually costs. Ownership isn't about whose name you expect to inherit. It's about whose name is already on the paper. If you are listening to this today, and someone in your own family has mistaken your quietness for weakness, do not panic. Do not beg for respect from people who have forgotten how to give it. Check your deeds. Organize your accounts. Stand firm in the boundaries you have built, and remember that no one has the right to erase you from the life you worked 40 years to pay for. If this story resonated with you, or if you have ever had to set a hard financial boundary with an adult child to preserve your own peace, leave a comment below and share your experience. Your story might be the exact reminder another parent needs today. Thank you for listening, and until next time, walk slowly but stand tall.